Yep.
Okay. Let's see.
I'm even dressed in wine. I hope you noticed.
I know I did. That's very.
Okay. I think we are live. Well, good afternoon, everybody. This is Patrick from the Poison Pen Bookstore in Scottsdale, Arizona. And we're here with another of our virtual events. And this evening, we have our good friend Ellen Crosby joining us once again to talk about her brand new wine country mystery, Bitter Roots. I don't know if you can see that cover. Beautiful cover.
Thank you.
And she signed a bunch of books for us. Sorry, this light is kind of plaguing me. And I'll go ahead and put a link to the autographed copies in the notes field or the comments field, should you wish to order one. And if you have questions for Ellen, just go ahead and put them in, and Barbara will summon me back on screen towards the end of the hour. So Barbara, we have our well-rehearsed little spiel down, don't we?
We really do. I was just admiring that you're word perfect. I'm so impressed. So indeed, this is a beautiful cover. And unfortunately, the lighting is not terrific, but I did think, I love the glass of wine. It's so beautiful. I was going to actually have a glass of wine, dressed in wine, you see.
You are.
And I was going to have a glass of wine. And then I looked again at the book and realized it's not a red wine. And the white wine, if I drink it, looks like water. So
I have water, so, you know.
Oh, well,
yeah.
yeah.
Can we raise a toast?
Yes, let's. Okay. Thank you for having me
Invisible toast
back.
for Barbara. Yeah.
I have been here for every book, Barbara. Every book I've written.
That's good.
Yeah.
And it's really been a great pleasure. And I love this Wine Country series. And one of the reasons I like it so well, aside from the characters and the plot, is that Ellen, who is a journalist at heart, as well as an author of fiction, really does her research. And so you always get to learn things. And I find the whole wine industry fascinating and its roots in Virginia. If you spend any time at all in Virginia, particularly if you've ever gone to Monticello, where Thomas Jefferson tried very hard to grow grapes, stock he brought back from France, never did prosper.
Right. Yeah.
Of course, climate change now means that they're growing wine, they're growing wine grapes in Scotland. So
yeah.
It's so weird. But anyway, I think you've done a wonderful job. And before we're done, Ellen, let's talk about your other character, whom I very much like, from Moscow Nights, and what's going on with her.
Oh, wow. Wow, that's a long time ago, Barbara. I wrote that book in you mean Claire Brennan from Moscow Nights?
Well, aren't you doing?
No,
something?
I'm doing the Sophie books. That's a different one.
Oh, it's Sophie.
Yeah.
Oh, right. Okay.
Right. Well, but you know what? That book was also had a little bit about Russia in it, and I was thinking about that today because the first book, Multiple Exposure, Sophie had she was living in London, and her husband was in an area of Russia that I invented, where they discovered oil, and so I ended up doing a lot of research on the oligarchs in London, and there wasn't a whole lot known, even 7 or 8 years ago about the oligarchs, and of course now you hear just about everything about them, their yachts and their fabulous homes and everything else, but. Yeah, it's what's happening now. When we lived in the Soviet Union, all the journalists, all of us who were kind of there, we sort of have all started reaching out to each other. And for us, having lived in Moscow, I mean, what's happening in Ukraine is just so awful. And when it was the Soviet Union, I mean, Andre, my husband's last trip before we came home was to Kiev, and so it was one of the Soviet republics. But we were living in the Soviet Union when there was a time of so much hope for it. It was the Gorbachev era. It was, sort of the end of the Soviet Union, the end of communism. I mean, things were opening up. You were starting to get things coming in from the West, and the possibility of more freedom of the press. And so to see this 30 years, just go back to what it was in the Cold War, and just how scary it is to see almost like a Stalinist figure, having this. The world in its sprawl it's just so scary. One of the journalists who I was the radio correspondent for ABC News, and so one of the television correspondents, when we all lived there, all of our kids were really young, and so the other day he put together like a whole clip of some of his television stories for ABC back, then Peter Jennings, and it was back 30 some years ago, and he sent it to his daughters, who are now my kids' age, and their husbands. And then I sent it to our sons because they were all little kids in Russia, and said, this is what it was like when you lived there. and the kids, you know, they just can't even imagine what it was like. It was just such a different world. And it just, we just can't stop watching television. I mean, it's just, you can't look away.
Well, I thought the New York Times, I think it was the Times, did a really good job with this article about,
Yes.
how Putin in 21 years or whatever
Mhm.
has morphed from what looked like a statesman and the opportunity
Yeah,
for,
yeah,
Russia to really be a
yeah.
leader in the global community to some clone of Hitler.
That
And,
front page article. Yeah,
I think
yeah,
it's the aging process. I think, it's a desperate grab for power is all I read, and I think it's true that all kleptocracies eventually come to an end. And, and they don't generally go pretty into that good night. And so
yeah,
here we are, one man's ego,
yeah.
basically, and a great deal of misinformation
But
at stake.
he didn't, but Andre, my husband he studied Soviet studies when we were both at Johns Hopkins. And so and he's also Russian. His grandmother was Ukrainian and his grandfather was Russian. So, I mean, he said that there were so many things that we let Putin get away with. I mean, that, that he took Crimea and he came in and he's already done things and didn't think that he was going to have any problems with it. And he reminded me tonight, he said the Russo-Japanese War, the Russians went in 1905 and thought they were just going to mop up. And he said, the Japanese just they won. And he said that's when Teddy Roosevelt came in and brokered the deal that got him the Nobel Peace Prize, which I had completely forgotten about. So, it's history repeating itself, it's.
Yeah, well, that's very true. However, we're here to talk about, sorry, I started this whole digression.
I
We're here to
know.
talk about wine in Virginia, the wine country mysteries. And this is for several books. We've been working our way towards a wedding. We have been working our way towards Lucy Montgomery and Quinn Santana, her winemaker, merging their lives and their skills. And so here we are now, because this is a mystery, you absolutely know when you pick this up and the wedding's in progress, that Ellen is going to find a way to derail it. And sure enough, she does.
I couldn't write the wedding book, I mean, that was like, I'm just not going to do it. And I had sort of dragged my feet through 6 books and I thought, all right, I have to get married. So to not write the wedding book, I thought, well, something has to go wrong. And I don't know if any, whoever might be watching, if any of you ever were in DC in 2012 when the derecho came through, this was the most unbelievable storm to hit Washington, DC in a generation, I think. And it just absolutely flattened the city. It came through with no warning. And so I thought, well, how about a derecho in my book? So I pretty much everything that happened in that book is exactly what happened to us. There was no power, there was no water. The really scary thing is I live in Fairfax County, Virginia, which is, we're on the edge of Washington, D.C. The CIA is there. The Pentagon's in the next county over, but we're right, in some Metro Washington, and we've got one of the best police departments, and we have helicopters, and we send people to take care of to earthquake victims and stuff like that. The whole system was just knocked out, and not only was the whole system knocked out, the whole backup system was knocked out. There was no 911 for days, and we had a wind-up radio, and so we were listening to the all news station. They said, well, pretty much drive to the police department or drive to the fire department and say, hey, could you, I mean, it was really, really scary. And so then gradually gas stations started, when they ran out of gas, there was no way to replenish it. So we started having gas lines. Stores just threw open their doors, like grocery stores. And when everything was gone and it had all rotted, I mean, there was just nothing. So I remember being in a grocery store like 10 days after this whole thing happened. And one of the managers came over to the clerk and he said to her, if anybody comes in here and needs ice, don't charge them, just give it to them. It was horrible. So climate change is coming. So I brought a derecho. And
well, I'm sure that more storms are in the offing.
Thank you. I feel good now.
We had one today, and we actually put a generator in last year after watching California and the California fires and the effect. I said to my husband, in Arizona, if you lose your power in the summer for more than a day, you can lose your whole house, because the heat's so extreme. And I thought, we should really put in a generator of our own.
Yeah.
And,
We're contemplating that too.
you know, and it comes out. In fact, it just did come on a little while ago because it tests itself every week. And I
Oh,
feel marginally better with, you
yeah.
know, with that as backup. But it's amazing how dependent we are now upon systems and the electric grid. And I'll tell you what I found really interesting. I think I was talking to Joe Cannon about it, but spycraft has gone back to old spycraft because of hacking and the vulnerability of the internet and so forth. And so, you know, when you used to write a note and hide it in a newspaper and pass it on a park bench, or you know, hide it in a tree, or you know,
Yeah,
whatever
yeah,
it all is, you
yeah,
can't hack that.
yeah,
And you know, and I think it's interesting that the more technologically dependent we become, the more old-fashioned kind of,
yeah.
you know,
Old school. Yeah,
ways of doing things, like driving to the police station,
yeah, yeah.
as you point out.
One of the
Um,
drops for for the what was his name? Robert Hansen was right near my kid's school, and it was in a park right near the school, and he just used to go over and leave things by a stone, and they'd find it.
yeah, well, I mean, I think it's an interesting question for thriller writers and stuff, you know, is that you get all geared up thinking, you know, everything's going to go so high tech, but in fact, you know, it may kind of reverse itself. But aside from the storm, which disrupts the wedding, that's not really going to be the murder.
No,
That, you know, is going to be part of the plot. But the real tragedy for this story is not actually the death of the person. Well, it is, but, you know, another tragedy, let me rephrase that, is what's happening to a swath of grapes. So, you know, you did a wonderful job describing it on pages 20 and 21, but why don't you tell us what plague has arrived?
okay, well, actually, what happened was, if anybody goes to my website, there's always sort of a header, and there's in one of the books, and the pictures are always mine. So for the last book, for the French Paradox, the picture was of a vineyard called Delaplane Cellars in Delaplane, Virginia, and it's the winemaker there is my has been for years been my wine advisor. And so that was the picture. It's gorgeous. I mean, it's really pretty, you know, it's typical Virginia with the rolling hills and the lush vineyards and everything else. So we were talking, well, I don't even what before I was writing this book, and he said to me, Ellen, you know that picture you have on your website, if you came out and took that picture today, there would be this really ugly swath of dead vines. And he told me the story of what happened is they bought the vines from you know, from a grower, and they planted them. And what's happened in America is that you know what you put in the ground is a different rootstock than the vine itself, because especially the French vines, you know, they're very fragile. So you put like a really hardy root in, and you put a seam. And so what happened was that this seam became infected, and what happens is no one finds out about the infection until like 3 years into when the grapes have been in the ground. So you've had 3 years with no harvest, you're waiting for your first harvest, and all of a sudden everything starts to die. And so Rick was telling me about this, and he talked about all the love they put into it, all the time they put into it, all the care they put into it, all the people they'd had come out, they fertilized, they this and they that. And the last thing he said to me is, I could kill somebody. And I was like, you know, I think that's a book. And you know, and he said, you just spend all this money and all this time. So then I started talking to a woman named Lucy Morton, who is actually sort of the inspiration for Lucy Montgomery, but she's one of the top wine advisors to vineyards in the US and in France. And she's been helping me a lot. She lives in Charlottesville. And so she was telling me that actually this happened in California in the 90s. So she told me the whole sordid story about what happened in California and how it just destroyed this very close-knit community of growers and vineyard owners and people who'd be paid off and everything else. And I said to her, and she was actually out in California, so she knew the whole story. And I said, can I use that? And she said, well, it was a long time ago and everybody's dead, so you can. So all of what happened is based on what happened in California in the 1990s and what happened here in Virginia. So there wasn't anything to make up. I just had them help me with the technical terms and not get too sort of dense and technical, but so that, you know, readers could kind of follow it. But, you know, it's climate change, and you know, it's affecting everything, and wine is our food. I mean, it's, you know, maybe something we drink and for pleasure, but more and more, you know, what's happening to our food.
Well, very true. But when you say destroyed a community, I mean, obviously finances are part of it because, there's a tremendous financial toll if you've invested in land and buying vines in 3 years of time and all, and then there's no payoff. But is there also a real blame culture that goes on when this happens as well?
That's basically what happened in California. And there were people who were paid off. And there's a university out there that was part of that was sort of invested in saying that these vines were okay. And I'm not even going to get into names, but it got very ugly. And Lucy actually felt quite threatened. I mean, it got pretty extreme. So, like I said, when Josie, who's the character, who's Lucy in my book, she gets threatened, it was pretty much taken from, the whole playbook, everything that Lucy told me, that, people will kill for this. I mean, it destroyed a farm. I mean, a farm that sold vineyards in California. I mean, one of the biggest. It's not a farm, but I forget what you call it. But anyway, they were absolutely destroyed and went out of business, and it was just horrible. And it took a long time for people to sort of recover from that. So what happened in my book is, everybody's blaming everybody else, and of course the growers are saying, in 3 years, we have no control over what happened. You've got climate change, you've got all this, you've got all these things going on. And then you've got the pushback from the people who bought the grapes saying, the vines saying, yeah, but you knew you couldn't guarantee that these were disease-free. And so it's a lose-lose situation. I mean, nobody wins in it. I mean, the grapes die anyway. And it's really hard. And the longer I've gone on writing the series, the more stories I've heard about, just these seasons of total, where the climate's just so bad that things are just totally washed out, or there's all these pests that come in or whatever. And, a hurricane will come through, and it's tough. It's really, really tough. There's more and more vineyards in Virginia. I mean, we drove down to Charlottesville for the Virginia Book Festival the week before last, and there were vineyards like everywhere. But it's a really tough way to make a living.
Well, but it's farming. I mean, exactly. And farming, for millennia has been subject to climate and disease and, finances and market demand and all the same things. So it would certainly be true of wine. So what you're looking at to start out here, and maybe only, is the Cabernet Franc grape. So what is a Cabernet Franc grape?
It is is it a noble grape? Now you got to put me on the spot, but it's a grape that does very, very well in Virginia, and that in a grape called Viognier. And so it's a slam dunk to grow this grape in Virginia. And so for it to die was a really big deal. So Virginia grows a lot of Cab Franc. And,
so are we looking at a white wine, or
it's a red. It's a red.
Yeah. Well, that's why I was a little confused by the cover, which has the white wine on it. But
yeah, I know.
There we go. Right. So, and I thought that failure to thrive, because that's a term that we hear applied in other situations. It can be children, it can be a lot of things, but basically what they're saying is, when they first notice that the Cabernet Franc is dying, is that it's a failure to thrive, but then it gets worse. And I think the term black goo is particularly repulsive.
The proper name is this unpronounceable thing. And then Lucy said to me, oh, we just call it black goo. And I was like, well, yeah, that works. And but she said what happens, and Rick was telling me the winemaker, because Lucy's now advises his vineyard, and he said, she came and she just, she took her secateur and she just cut right through it, and this tarry stuff oozes out, and it's supposed to be clear liquid, obviously, because nothing can get to the leaves, and nothing's going to grow. And he said, you're just heartsick. And he said, you just rip it out of the ground and you're done. And he said, it's just really it's over. And so you have to start again. You have to rip them out and start all over again. And the ironic thing is, and I think I explained this later in the book, that there was this pest called a louse called phylloxera, which was a very tiny mite or something, where American vines were sent to Europe, and they ended up infecting all the European vines and killing huge swaths of vines all throughout France and everything else. And so it was a really big deal. And so they discovered that the only way to save the French vineyards was to take the rootstock of the exact same vines, the hardy American vines that had brought the louse over, and then graft them onto the French vines. So there's a seam on these vines, and so now that's what they do in America is when they've got Merlot or something, it's going to be Chardonnay, it's going to be fragile. They take a hardy rootstock from like a big American, hybrid or something, and they put these beautiful French, the Merlot and Cab Sauvignon and all that. They graft them. But what happened is in saving vines from the phylloxera, they brought in this where the joints get infected. So they've brought in yet another crisis for the vineyards, and so that's what's killing the vines now. And there's
a whole lesson here about globalization and whether, in fact, I've just finished Jim Rollins's new book, and I'm going to be talking to him in April. It doesn't come out till the 18th, but that's one of the things he's talking about is in Africa, is when you bring something that has its own ecosystem and so forth, and you move it to somewhere else, you're inviting disaster. And we can see all over the world where pests that one part of the world can contain arrive largely through travel anymore. Arrive in another part of the world. It could be like the pythons in Florida, or things that have attacked trees. I remember Dutch elm disease. We lost all the chestnut trees and the chestnut blight. And so when we do stuff like that, when we mess around with Mother Nature and her ecology, we can get some really terrible results. And certainly it's been true in the wine industry, both with the phylloxera and the black goo, that moving vines back and forth. Has New Zealand, do you know whether New Zealand and Australia have had to put up or Argentina, because those are big wine growing areas?
I think the phylloxera went to Australia, but the black goo, it's just kind of coming here now, I think. So I don't know if it's gotten there yet, but I mean, inevitably it's going to,
It probably will. South Africa too has a very healthy wine industry. One of my favorite wines, we now import it, is a rosé that we first drank in South Africa.
Oh, really?
Just north of Cape Town in the Dutch province. I'm trying to remember how to pronounce it, Franjos or whatever it is. Anyway, and wine growing is moving north, as we earlier mentioned. I'm pretty sure Iceland will have its own wine here.
It will. Yeah, well, it's crazy, isn't it?
And then some of the older vineyards in hotter climates may not thrive because that it's going to be too tough for the grapes. But
they're dealing with that in France already, because they're finding that some of the grapes that grow better there are Spanish grapes. So what are you going to do in Bordeaux? I mean, how are you going to, how are you going to grow all, bring these Spanish grapes to Bordeaux and start growing them there? Wow. What are they going to do? It's
a huge question. And since terroir is such a major part of what distinguishes wine, as in Bordeaux or Champagne or wherever it is, that particular climate, that particular soil, actually in vineyards, it can even change, depending on the elevation. If there's a higher ground in the vineyard and a lower one, or if you have a south slope versus a north or an east or a west, and all of that can really affect the taste of the grapes. But, a place like Bordeaux, which has for centuries had its own terroir and produced its own particular bouquet and taste and so forth, Spanish grapes may ruin that.
French and the Spanish grapes, yeah, really. I mean, one of the things that's interesting about Virginia, and I think I mentioned it in the book, is you can just grow anything here. I mean, you can't grow anything, but you can consider any possibility. So in Bordeaux, you're going to grow those particular grapes, but here you can grow a Russian grape, an Italian grape, a Portuguese grape, and whatever, one of the noble grapes, a hybrid, Lucy Morton, who I've been talking to, she's working on something right now, and they're actually growing it at Cornell, and finding a grape that used to be in the United States and ended up in France. They're trying to bring it back and recultivate it here in France. So it's a whole changing world. It really is.
For sure. I'm trying to remember if it was in New Zealand or Australia, but one of them, when some of the English settlers came, they brought along, like rabbits or something for hunting, and, loosed a plague upon whatever country this was, where the rabbit wasn't wasn't native. I think that's true of deer in New Zealand too, which is now the biggest exporter of deer meat to Germany. So, there's all this weird stuff. I think the pandemic kind of illustrated for us that some of these overstretched supply chains have serious consequences and disrupting the whole global supply chain, such as the current battle in the Ukraine has some serious effects.
That's the breadbasket of Europe, don't forget. I mean, wait till, that starts to,
Well, once upon a time, Egypt was the breadbasket of the Roman Empire. And then, things came along and really messed that up. So Israel was once a green and fertile land. It wasn't really a desert. So
Did I tell you years ago when I was writing Ghost Image, which was the other book in my Sophie Medina series, I went to, after reading an article, I think it's Smithsonian, I went back to England, and there is a place, it's called the Millennium Seed Bank, and it's outside of London, and they are frantically collecting seeds from all over the world and storing them. And they've got them below ground in a place that you have to go in with like a pole or suit, and you can't stay in longer than like 5 minutes or something, or alarms go off. But they are storing as many seeds as they possibly can in case of the unthinkable. And they're labeling them, and they're trying to get seeds before they become extinct, and also trying to find old seeds and figure out how they could germinate. So does it need heat? Does it need cold? What does it need? So it's one of the most fascinating places I've ever visited in my life.
I'm sure it is. And the original one was in Greenland because,
that's crops, and it's in the ice. And I think if it's Greenland, the Millennial Seed Bank is seeds and things like that, but the crops is underground in the ice, and it's in Greenland, I think, or someplace up there. Norway maybe, but there's two there. So there's the two places.
Yeah, which is a really worthy endeavor. I mean, what do you do? It doesn't have to be atomic warfare or whatever. It could be fire. It could be a whole lot of things that would destroy whatever the native stuff is, and you would want to have a seed bank to help replenish all that. I mean, did you notice there's a book out, a recent book, maybe this month, about the impact of the meteor and the reason that it killed off not just the dinosaurs, but killed off nearly everything.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and because when it struck in the place it struck, it released a stunning amount. I'm trying to remember, it was of nitrogen or something, whatever it hit, in the Caribbean, and the velocity at which it hit and the place that it hit released this enormous poisonous clouds of gas into the atmosphere that drifted then and basically wiped out everything, everything living in its path. And it cleared the decks so that when it finally settled, the little mammals, compared to dinosaurs, the mammals had a chance to then thrive because, these other species had been wiped out. So there's a cycle in the history of the world that we are seeing repeating right now. We're just accelerating it. That's what we're doing. But the question's inevitably going to arise: at what temperatures can people live? At what temperatures can grapes grow? Whatever. If the world keeps heating up, at some point it's going to have
I think about you in Arizona, and I remember being out there in the summer in August when I had a book out, and the guys at the hotel wouldn't even let me walk the 1 block from the hotel to the store without a bottle of water because they were afraid I'd pass out. It was so hot. And that was years ago, and it's gotten even hotter, hasn't it?
Well, now it actually has stayed just about the same. It really has.
Pretty hot.
There's so many things that we could do. There are projects underway to do things like make roofs green so they don't reflect heat back into the atmosphere. They can coat roads with rubber that they can make from discarded tires and all, and try to cut down on all of that. I'm not even talking about emissions and so forth. I'm talking about reflected stuff, concrete, roadways, that kind of thing that create a heat sink. So when you have a metropolitan area like Phoenix, it heats up. And the problem is, once it does that, none of that concrete and all the rest of it releases the heat. So it stays too hot. And that's something that we actually could in part fix. if, we got around to it in time. Is there a lot of ways to reduce the problem? But there isn't any way to deal with stuff like, the pine borer killing off the forests and that kind of thing, which provides tinder, which allows for more fires. But then maybe, in the nature of things, maybe if there are huge swaths taken out by fire, there's a rebirth that's possible. That's not very helpful if you live in that area, if you just lost your home or your your vineyard or your land and all, then, that's a high price for you to be paying. But there's a renewal cycle that probably is going on. And it'll be, remember when they had the Yellowstone fire and there was a huge debate about whether to let it burn or whether to try to contain it. And I think eventually they let it burn because there was so much stuff on the ground that allowed this fire in part to prosper, and it was better to just burn it all away. And then try to do better forest management. So, it's a really deep and interesting question. But we haven't talked about the people in this book. We're talking about the vines.
I know. This is a really heavy sort of. Oh.
It is. I didn't really mean to go there, but here we are. So Lucy and Quinn, the storm's going to disrupt their marriage, but inevitably there is so much friction over this black goo and so much blame going around that somebody dies. I can't remember. She doesn't die all that early on, does she? Isn't it?
No. And I was wondering about that because I knew it was late, and I just, I talked to my editor about it, and she was okay with it. And I'm in this critique group. I don't know if you know, there's 5 of us. We've met every single month without fail for 11 years.
Wow.
Yep. And if we can't meet on, say, like everybody's got something going on in May, or there's a lot of conferences, we'll meet at the beginning of April and the end of April and call the end of April May. But we've met every single month for 5 years, 11 years. And so I talked to them about it, and everybody was like, well, you can do it. And so the murder doesn't take place till well into the story. And I kept thinking, how can I move it back? What can I cut out? But I just left it. And it is.
I didn't intend that as a criticism at all.
No, I know. No, I know. But I definitely thought about it because you really kind of want the pace to sort of take off and people to have, you want the momentum to go. And so to keep it that late, that was definitely a decision that I debated it. So it's interesting that, that you would bring it up because it was something.
Well, I think this particular story, you have to lay a lot more groundwork. There are stories where you can in fact knock off somebody on the first page and then it unspools from there. But there are other stories, and I think myself it's boring, in the series to have everything always happen the same way. Right. So, I think the record, the absolute record for delaying the appearance of the murder victim is held by Deborah Crombie, who was 156 pages in when the victim dies. And, but it worked brilliantly in that particular book.
She's a good friend. We're next to each other on bookshelves all the time.
But, I thought it's one of her most interesting books. And it's good to do something different. And I think the emotional resonance of this death would not be the same if you had rushed it, if you hadn't laid all the groundwork. And I didn't think that the death would have the same impact on everybody.
Well, I think sort of the whole question. I always find this so interesting. Is like, how much do you trust somebody you know and love, and where one of the Quinn is one of the suspects in the death of this woman, and she wanted to see him, and he went to see her, and she was gone. So he feels the guilt that had he gotten there sooner, that maybe whatever happened to her, he could have prevented it. So he's feeling all this guilt, and then he's clearly not telling Lucy something, and they're a week away from their marriage, and what doesn't she know, and do you just, how much can you trust somebody you love? And I think that's a real, that's sort of a thread that's been woven through a lot of my books, is because for me, a lot of that story, a lot of the series is about family. And what always sort of motivated me is why Lucy gets involved is because something happens to someone she loves. And so, you love somebody, you trust them, and then it's a small town too. So, and then then you're betrayed, and how does that reverberate through the town? So I just find that a really fascinating subject, especially, now when you fake news and what can you trust, and people say things and they just think if you just keep saying it enough, mud sticks, and you just go on and you just wait for the next news cycle. So I just find that absolutely fascinating.
Well, the other question I think that's coming more and more to the fore is consequences and
Mhm.
what's the nature of justice. Lisa Scottolini and I had a long discussion about that last night.
Right.
What's the difference between justice and the law?
Mhm.
Because, it's clear that there's been an increasing separation.
Yep.
And, people have flagrantly broken the law, but have not been brought to justice.
Mhm.
And, so part of it is how much do we trust our legal system? How much do we trust the people, that we expect to enforce it?
Living in Washington, it just feels like it's right on top of us. I
Yeah.
don't know if it's the proximity to the DC or what, or the fact that our local news is also national news, but and so many, everybody, well, not everybody, but so many people where I live work for the government. They work, they're involved in something to do with the government. And so it's just very pervasive here. And it feels like you can't get away with it. And it seems to me that it might be a little bit less the further away from the epicenter, of Washington that you go, that you're sort of aware of it, but it's not as like on top of you as it is here.
No, I don't think so. I think the erosion of public trust has been tremendous.
Oh, yeah.
And I'm not sure it's a wound that we can recover from, but it's a larger scale of what you're talking about in the book. How much can you trust, or how much do you know the people that you love? But then you also have to ask, how much can you trust the people that in theory you're supposed to be looking after you?
Yeah.
This whole defund the police thing, for example. You expect them to maintain order and risk their lives, and in a very dangerous job, and yet there's always a downside to it. And which of us knows how we'd behave in a split second situation? I think there are there's so many different variables, and it is really hard to.
I had a lawyer friend who used to say, "There, but for the grace of God, go any of us on any given day."
Yeah, well, I often wonder. Right. Well, I often wonder why anybody would want actually to take a job like that anymore, because the downsides of it are very difficult. But I think many people are really, think that keeping order, keeping people safe, establishing rules and living by them is still important.
Yeah.
And I'm going to be really interesting to see, because I think that's where this chasm has to a great degree arisen. And I would be really interested to see if that holds, if the center, so to speak, can hold in the face of absolutely willful violation. You live near Washington, where it's a disaster. We live in Arizona, I live in Arizona, which is another place just absolutely riddled with people who seem to be living on a third planet.
We haven't touched the third rail also that I wrote about. I'm sort of waiting for you to get around it, but the dismantling of the Confederate monuments, which took place while I was writing the book. And that's what I had, Lucy's brother was involved in. So there's a lot of, sort of third rail issues that I went near in this book, I think.
That was hard to understand. Can you repeat that?
That while I was writing the book, it was the summer where the Confederate monuments were being defaced, and then they were all being pulled down. And so I felt like I had to get into that. And again, I had a lot of conversations with my agent, with my editor, with the critique group, and a couple of people said, like, you don't need to do that. But I really felt like I did. So Lucy's brother has gone down to Richmond and he's biracial, and has taken the monuments down. And what I set up in the book is, when I started writing this book in 2000, I'm a New Englander, and I didn't know anything about the Civil War, most of which was fought in Virginia. So I kind of learned as I was going along, as I was writing. And I set up some things that were true to the character. Her family had owned slaves. They were on the side of the South. They were Confederates and proud of it. And so I had to live with that when I got to this part of the book. And so it took me a really, really long time to figure out how I was going to write I just thought it had to be there about the dismantling of the Confederate monuments and what it had meant to Virginia and how it was having an impact on everything, you know, I mean, all around me, all this, there's schools are changing names, streets are changing names, highways are changing names.
Yeah.
It's unbelievable. So that ended up in there too. I just felt like I had to write about it.
Well, I don't think you can ignore it. I mean, there again, I think the journalist in you, you know, is never going to be completely squelched. And so if you're being kind of a witness to, you know, what's going on, you want to put it in your books, then, you know, I think it's important. I mean, I lived in Virginia for a while, and I can remember very much the sort of Monument Row in Richmond, you know, that whole swath that you would drive along, and there would be, and in fact, I don't remember how it works, but there was a whole language of horses, because almost all of the statues, a huge number of them were generals or, you know, officers, let's put it that way. And they're all astride because that was how, you know, how they operated. And there was a language to horses about, you know, the hooves and whether these were people who died or these were people who were victorious or I can't remember what. But, you know, there was like a code of tone for the horses. And, you know, and there you go.
I'm going to try to show you something if I can. So when I was researching this, Don Andrews, who's in my critique group and lives up the street from me, had a friend who's now a photographer in New York. And she said, you know, he's went down to Richmond and he took all these photographs and he's crowdfunding sort of a soft cover book. And if he gets enough money, he'll publish a hardcover. So I funded him. And so I got a copy of the book, and I'm going to see if I can do this. These are the monuments.
Wow.
Yeah. Can you see it? So, I mean, there was a lot of anger, and then they pulled them all down. The one they pulled down in Leesburg, which is the town near me, which has always been in my book, they did it in the dead of night. They just one morning.
Well, you know, one of the questions, I mean, aside from all the political and social issues involved is, you know, is what about the art? I mean, if we'd had that attitude, many of the world's great art treasures wouldn't even exist now. You know, because art also reflects its time in its era.
And where do you stop too? You know, how far do you go? When we went to drove down to Charlottesville to the book festival 2 weeks ago, we got it's always this one hotel where you stay and everything takes place on the pedestrian mall, but you pull up and there's a statue of Lewis and Clark. And I said to my husband, I think that statue's gone. So I was like, what did Lewis and Clark do? I mean, I had forgotten, but there, you know, how much you're going to take this all away and what are you going to do with it, you know? And are people going to, do you want something else to go there? What do you want to happen? And my husband reminded me of this, and I wrote about it in the book, of this place in Moscow when they took down all the statues of all the communists, there's Lenin and Stalin and everything else. They sort of threw them in a park along the Moscow River, and now they've turned it into a big, it's called the Park of the Fallen Monuments, and they've added all these other things, and so they've kind of taken away the meaning of it's not just an homage to the communist era, but there's so many other things there. People go rollerblading and they have picnics and there's yoga class and all that stuff. So, you know, what are you going to do with that part of your heritage and your history?
I think they're very complicated questions, and it's too bad that social media, the internet, does not allow reflection anymore.
Yes. Unfiltered comments are just.
Well, it's not just, I mean, there's this constant, you know, kind of crisis mode because, and, you know, the media is not exempt for it. It's all clicks and they can't turn themselves away. I mean, they can't turn themselves away from Trump, you know, because it's just clickbait. And I think, as you pointed out earlier when we were talking, that you know, stuff like, you know, Instagram has changed so dramatically, where it used to be, you know, a pleasant place where you could go and share photos. And now it's either commercial or, you know, much of it is filled with political messages or buy my products or whatever. And I don't think that we are living in a time when actions can be considered with any at deliberate speed. And so, you know, wise decisions can be made. Instead, you know, we seem to swing into outrage. and, and make, the advice has always been, if you lose somebody important to you, someone in your family dies, let's say one of your parents dies or something, or your second parent dies, the wisdom is always you should wait a year, before you make any dramatic changes or decisions. If you've lost your spouse, whatever. And, that was to allow a period of reflection and really think about things and not make a hasty disposition of things that you might later truly regret. And that leisure is more and more evaporating.
Well, the other thing that really concerns me, and I'm partway through a book, it's pretty dense. It's not as easy a book to get through as I had thought it would be, but it's called The Shallows, What the Internet is Doing to Our Brain. And I've been really interested in, figuring out like how I've changed and how I've been manipulated and like what I can do to sort of cut the cord and not be so sucked into the whole social media. You can spend a day and all of a sudden you look around and what have you done? Scrolled and scrolled and scrolled. And
well, I solved the problem neatly because I don't do it.
Good for you.
I don't belong to Facebook.
But I don't see I don't think we have that luxury. So today I went on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter to, say that, I was going to be here tonight so that people would know. And I can't, but I think I get punished, especially on Facebook, because I'm rarely there. So like, if you don't go on that often, and my son works for Meta, one of my sons. So if you don't go on that much, it's like, well, no one's going to see it. We're going to punish you. And there's your algorithm. So I don't know. That's crazy.
Well, I professionally, I do the Instagram for the bookstore as my own contribution. Patrick does Facebook and another staff member does Twitter and so forth. But I don't have any personal social media, and other than posting things on Instagram, I don't look at anything, and it saves me an enormous amount of angst. And once or twice, there have been attacks. We supported an author that unfortunately and totally unfairly, God, I think the word is doxed, but I can't remember for sure if that's even the right. Anyway, there's a whole storm of outrage that rolled,
I think I know what you're talking about.
Yeah. And so it wasn't me personally. I was offended for her, and, I deleted the post and then I put it back up again to get rid of all the nasty comments. And sure enough, the storm blew over, and most of the people that were doing that actually didn't have any personal stake in it.
I know.
They just wanted to pile on to something they thought would be. And if you go and, every once in a while, just somehow or other, there'll be something on Instagram, and I will look at the comments, and most of them are just insane. They're completely pointless. And furthermore, the people who made them are not even doing it under their real names. So there's no meaning to any of it.
I know.
So why spend my time on it is my attitude.
I agree. I still love beautiful pictures though. So I love looking at, there's like the travel places. There's right now with the cherry blossoms in Washington, there's so many gorgeous pictures of Washington.
I know it is beautiful. And I really enjoy putting the puppies up, it's kind of fun.
Yeah.
But we probably dissuaded you with this slightly more political discussion than I ever thought about. But Bitterroots is actually a delightful book, and it does, as all of Ellen's books do, she always handles social issues and economic issues. And in her other series, not just the Moscow-based one, but the one about the photographer, I think you've done a wonderful job bringing in Washington history. So before we call it, Patrick, are you writing something new with your photographer?
I am, and it's about Washington history. It's about the murder of an associate justice of the Supreme Court, which I started writing before Breyer stepped down and everything else. So, and then also about homelessness.
Well, I think that's great. Are the older books in that series going to be reprinted?
So my agent went to Simon & Schuster and asked for the rights back for the first two books. And then my new publisher bought them and has reissued both Multiple Exposure and Ghost Image in trade paperback. And they came out February 1st. So they're just kind of, I would say, like, they said, well, they're there if anybody wants them. But when the new book comes out, I'm turning it in September. So it'll be out in 2023. And he said, but they have the whole series now. So it was kind of cool that they did that. And especially considering I wrote those books in like 2014 and 2015, I think, because they came out in 2015 and 2016. So the hiatus between the last book and the new book is going to be 8 years. And I'm eternally grateful to Dominic, to my agent and my editor, that they had enough faith in me that I could pull this off and come, make a comeback after 8 years. So we'll see. I read something for Jungle Reds. James Crosby asked me to write about what is it like, will people follow you after you've, had this hiatus. And the story that I wrote was about a loon that had landed in a little tiny pond, accidentally got sort of distracted and ended up in this pond in suburban Fairfax near where I live. And the loon could not take off from the pond because the pond was too small. So there's all of a sudden it has a Facebook page and everybody wants to get the loon to a bigger pond. So they brought in a scientist and another guy and they got a boat. And in the middle of the night, they went out and threw a bag over the loon's head and captured it and moved it to the bigger pond. So it had a bigger runway. So my question is like, am I going to get a big enough runway to take off with this book when it comes out next year? So I'm hoping the answer is yes. And I got so many affirmative comments on that Jungle Reds post that said, of course that you're going to. I mean, people are going to read for the books. They don't, people will follow you. So we'll see.
Well, I think a lot of people will discover the book, and then if they're really interested, they can go back and read the two earlier ones. But I don't think you should think that the success of the book will be dependent on on the two earlier ones, but it'd be nice to have them if people,
the other thing is,
explore.
I took a break. I wrote six of the books in the wine series, and then I was done. I needed a break. So I wrote these other two books, and that was a 5-year hiatus. Then I came back to the series again, and I wrote 6 more. And I think, you have to sort of write, you need like the energy and the juice. And I just felt like I kind of wrote the end in this one, and I will never say never, but I'm just ready to be done now for a while, or maybe permanently, I don't know. But
you got them to the a place that you've been heading for quite a while, and there are plenty of other interesting things to write about. You do live for all of the excitement and so forth. You do live in a really interesting area, with lots and lots of history, lots of action, and all. So why not write about it? Patrick, why don't we call you up and see if there's any comments you'd like to make or questions?
All right, let's see. Any actual questions? You have a lot of fans and readers watching.
Thank you.
And making nice
comments.
Thank you all. Yeah, I don't see too many actual questions. Just people really like the series. One question that you've already addressed: will there be more Lucy Montgomery books? Or do you have any interest in writing something completely different, a new series, perhaps, or?
I do actually, and I talked about that with my agent and my editor.
Could you try again?
Technology ruined the theater.
But I've just got a lot of things going on in my personal life right now. My husband is not well, and so I'm kind of, I don't think I have it in me to start something new and have all that energy. And this book, actually, we haven't talked about this, Barbara, but I'm sure you've talked about it with other authors. This is the first book I've written totally during COVID. Yeah. And I get so much of my energy from going out. I need to be in the place. I need to, I need to be there at the right time of year. Like, what are the sounds you hear? What do you smell? What's in the air? All 5 senses. And to not go out was really different. And so that's why this book was different. I wasn't sure how, what kind of reception it would get, because it just felt different. So I think hopefully when we start getting back to whatever the new normal is, I'd like to write a standalone and try something different. I really would.
Well, you just have to wait until the time is right,
Yeah.
And it'll be interesting to see what you do. I didn't ask you about that because that's a question that for some authors is a hard one to address.
Yeah.
So, how did I spend the pandemic and what did it do for me?
I've heard from a lot of people, and like my agent used to call me every week and he was like, good, you can still write. And, but I've heard people who said that, we live in a pandemic world anyway. We're just so solitary. I mean, it's like, what changed? Not much. It's just that everybody's working from home now, but writers are, a lot of us are introverts, and we're used to just being at our desk. I mean, I'm happiest when I'm here at my desk writing, and I find it sort of hard to actually go out and do events because I'm such an introvert. And so But I did miss getting out and doing the research, because that just fuels me. That's just so, talking to people and picking up all the little things that, that sort of make the book richer and deeper, and that you wouldn't know. It's like, well, I could do that, and so that you can go back and weave the plot together again.
Who do you like to read? That's one of the questions that's come in. Who are some of your favorite writers?
Oh gosh, I read a lot of nonfiction. I read a lot, I guess. Right now I'm reading Eric Larson's The Splendid and the Vile, which is wonderful. He's such a good writer. I just interviewed 3 authors for the Virginia Book Festival, and I read their books, which were terrific. Alma Katsu's Red Widow, wonderful book. Loved it. It's about a mole and, a Russian mole in the CIA, which was of course right up my alley. And then I read Kelly Garrett's Like a Sister, which was terrific. And Naomi Hirahara's
Clark and Division.
Clark and Division, which was great. And to get to talk to them and find out the backstories for those books was really, really interesting. So that was a great panel at the book festival. So that's sort of and I just finished Lara Prescott's The Secret We Kept, again it's more Russia, but about the CIA, based on the true story of the CIA plot to smuggle Dr. Zhivago back into Russia, because Pasternak had not been allowed to publish it there. So
interesting. Well, that's about it for actual questions.
Okay. Well, thank you all.
Well, it's been wonderful to talk to you. I miss you. I'm sorry.
I miss
that
you too.
I know. Ellen's been here so many times, so we've done fun things like go to the local botanical garden and other stuff.
And we had some great meals and shared wine, bought glasses of wine.
They'll come around again.
Will.
It's been grand to have a very nice conversation
with
you. And I will certainly look forward to seeing your book next year, because I thought the 2 that you wrote were excellent. Remind us of the titles.
Multiple Exposure and Ghost Image, 2 photography type terms. Yeah.
And
the new one, I think the new one right now, the tentative title of the new one is Blow Up.
There you are. Wonderful. Anyway, we do have signed copies left of Bitter Roots, and I hope that we've interested you enough to buy one. I really enjoyed it a lot, and I've liked the whole series. I do think that right now it's in a good place, and if you want to move on and do something else for a bit, that your fans will be okay with that.
Thank you.
We'll talk next year. Right.
Okay,
Bye, everybody. Thanks for joining us.
Take care, you guys. Miss you.